T-Space Architecture Lecture Series 2022. This is the fourth in a series of 9 public lectures organized by T-Space, and that's within the framework of the Architecture Residency program. I am Irina Tsahrelia. I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York, and I'm currently directing the residency program for T-Space. I've been instructing our residents since the beginning of the program in 2017. So it has been running for 6 years now, along with Stephen Hall, of course, and a series of incredible guests that we have invited over the years. This is the 3rd year we're running the program online with our beautiful T-Space team, our coordinator Marisa Espe, and this year's host Yasmina Parto, who's here with us. Hi, Yasmina.
Hi, everyone.
Yasmina is the co-host for this event. She's an architect and currently practicing with Stephen Hall Architects. For those who are new, T-Space is a nonprofit organization. It's an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation, and it focuses on art, education, design, and ecology. And the programming, in addition to the T-Space residency, includes events that are called the Synthesis of the Arts every summer on the grounds on Rhinebeck. These events are about bringing together of architecture, music, poetry, and art. And there are some events that you can see here on the screen that are coming up very soon. July 17th with Arlene Shehead, and her work is titled Couple Off. We will be very excited to see you on T-Space if you'd like to join. And on September 4th, there is Pamphlet Architecture Exhibition also coming up. So keep an eye on the chat. There is information how you can arrange to join and how to schedule a tour or what the gallery hours are. So please keep an eye on the chat for this kind of information. The lecture that you have joined today, titled New Habits and New Habitats, The Search for a Viable Model by Ellen K. Levy. It's part of the Architecture Residency program. The residency is a 25-day intensive. This is the residents who are joining us here on the panel. I've started really diving deep into their projects at this point, formulating their ideas, thought experiments, and they're here on our panel joining from Ithaca, Canada, Greece, California, Minnesota. Hello, everyone. Yahya, Teresa, Isabella, Stephen, Jingwen, and Lathina. So I would like to just add one more note about our scholarship program. We are very, very pleased all our residents are supported in full with very generous scholarships. And that includes the Stillman Scholarship, the Pullman Scholarship, honoring Jenny Crane this year, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, the Carpilero Scholarship, the Al Held Scholarship, the 100 Mile Scholarship, as well as incredible support by Elise Jaff and Jeffrey Brown, as well as Stan Allen. So we're very, very grateful that you make this happen. It's an incredible resource, not only for our residents, but also for the general public who has access to this thoughts and debate that goes on. So we welcome you very much to make contributions to make this program possible, and you can see the chat on how to do that. The theme for this year, 2022, Cosmic Dust, Space and Time. It couldn't be more timely today with James Webb Space Telescope releasing images, which probably will completely change our understanding of the cosmos. So that's a very interesting coincidence, and I'm very excited to hear more from Ellen and open up to a discussion. I will pass it on right away to Yasmina. She can very briefly describe the webinar structure, and then we will introduce Ellen and pass it on to you, Ellen, in a few moments. Thank you all.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. We have about 35 minutes of presentation by Ellen Levy. Thank you, Ellen, again for joining us and accepting our invitation. And after that, we have approximately 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A led by our panelists and audience as well. Please make sure you put your questions in the chat throughout the lecture, and we'll address it at the end of the lecture. And I will encourage you to always check the chat for relevant information. We will be populating the chat with information about T-Space and how you can have access to the lecture. And thank you so much, Ellen. I will pass it to Jingwen, our resident, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmina. Hello, I'm Jingwen, and I'm greatly honored to welcome artist Ellen Levy to the T-Space Rhinebeck and Stephen Martin Hall Foundation Architecture Lecture Series. Ellen K. Levy, PhD, is a multimedia artist and writer known for exploring art, science, and technology interrelationships since the mid-1980s. Her graduate studies were at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, following a Bachelor of Arts from the Mount Holyoke College in Zoology. She was president of the College Art Association from 2004 to 2006, before earning her doctorate in 2012 from the University of Plymouth on the art and neuroscience of attention. She then was special advisor on the arts and sciences at the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts. She was a distinguished visiting fellow in arts and sciences at Skidmore College in 1999, a position funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, and has taught interdisciplinary classes at numerous institutions, including the New School, Cooper Union, Brooklyn College, and Banff. She was exhibited widely in the US and abroad. So thank you so much, Ellen, for joining us today. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ellen Levy, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And I think what I'll do is start by bringing up my PowerPoint. Just make sure this is working. Okay, can everyone see it all right? So,
Ellen, I think you should share the screen. Perfect.
Is that
we can see it right now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I've made note of the residents' varied backgrounds, and I'm really happy to be here. Many of you list involvement in ecological concerns, not a surprise. I hope that my own experiences as an artist will resonate with aspects of your own studies and practice. And I am focusing today on the idea of models. Our understanding of nature and of evolution have undergone great changes. This has affected both architecture and art. Contemporary thinking about models has become complex, dynamic, and receptive to holistic ideas and to views of other species' solutions to architectural challenges, as yesterday's speaker on this series pointed out. Many of us believe that physical generative forces are interactive throughout the universe. In short, our horizons have greatly expanded, while our constraints have also grown, given the grim realities of global warming and migrations due to multiple causes. How do we conceive form under these circumstances? How do we adapt to changing circumstances through form? My attention today is focused on an analysis of models in light of new habits and new habitats. Models in the form of drawings and plans offer insights into the thinking of a period. Here you have a visionary look at glass houses dotting the Alps. Architect members of the Crystal Chain group manifested utopian dreams in the 1920s in models they never realized of a state of harmony, transparency, and community. The members included Bruno Taut, Wendell Hablich, Hermann Fisterlin, and even Walter Gropius. Their aim was to forge a philosophy of design that resonated with the laws of form generation in nature. Historian Kate Arman writes that their ideas were influenced in part by the writer Paul Scherbart and by biologist Eric Heckel's Art Forms in Nature, which came out in 1904. The latter combined an avid interest in Darwin's theories of evolution with monism, the quest for an underlying order. Now, by contrast, imagine what you see here. Here you have another model based on crystals, these represent a changing interactive world. It's by William Lamson, a sculptor. Bad Water is the name of it, and it's a model from which one is intended to learn environmental strategies. He describes his work as an abiotic complex network of non-living things that, while inanimate, quote, continue to exert their material agency. And he does this with a climate controlling infrastructure to create an accelerated cycle of flood and drought. He's inspired by the resilient ecosystem in Death Valley's Badwater Basin that has evolved to withstand very harsh conditions. What he does as an artist is to bring geologic forces into a gallery, allowing them to develop over the duration of his exhibitions. Now, I've brought this image by Yakov Chernikov, which was done before 1933, into the mix of models. I first saw this work in a show at MoMA in 1990 that was curated by Catherine Cook and featured architectural drawings of the Russian avant-garde. The constructivists were designing a new urbanism around tenets from engineering and the machine. These models reflect influence from the Bauhaus and the wider constructivist art movement that emerged. Such works also reflected socio-political ethos, especially of communism. Few of the works were realized, but many subsequent architectural movements, such as brutalism, incorporated their ideas. So I ask, what creates a viable architectural model today? My talk is in two parts. The first part, a shorter part, will show some of my own search for models and the art produced over a long span of time. The second longer part will show how several architects have used ideas based on a 1917 treatise by Darcy Wentworth Thompson on which to develop their architecture. This talk is really about the remarkable persistence of an idea that is still potent and still developing, that I hope will be inspiring to you. The two parts are followed by a discussion of the potential utility of Thompson's approach to city planning at a time of global warming and in light of our new understandings of dissipative forces, evolutionary theory, and entropy. So at this point in time, models have really entered and achieved the status of scientific proofs, which is interesting in itself. So I look for models that can reconcile the objectivity of quantification, and I'm going to back to here, reconcile the objectivity of quantification with the subjectivity of experience, allow for development, transformation, and even decay, and assist sustainability and a fruitful coexistence with other species. You will see some of the influence of complex systems in the next group. In 1991, I saw this particular issue of Scientific American that featured experiments by scientists Peerback and Kan Chen. They utilized dominoes to model a precarious state called self-organized criticality. It furthered my understanding of complex systems theory, which has created a unified approach to the understanding of nature that explores how parts are related to wholes, describing the interactions between environment, system, and observer. A minor event, in this case, the toppling of a domino, can cause a chain reaction to occur in the overall system. So the question it leads to is, can we promote urban ecological resilience with simulations done today that utilize complex systems and its models like domino models in its city planning? In the next work is one example of my adapting this theory. For me, dominoes suggested the layout of cities where communities are entities in which physical conditions and the social order are constantly changing. Here are some other examples. At that time, I was exhibiting these works at American Associated Artists Contemporary in New York City under the direction of Emilio Steinberger. And I showed them in Germany and also in Israel. Interestingly, viewers readily liken them to the fall of the Soviet Union. And in the next work, I showed this work in which shows the collapse of the Hartford roof in 1978 with the dominoes in the upper middle background. It collapsed because of an underestimation of the weight of the roof and differences between the design and the actual built structure. And on the next slide, some more examples of these drawings. And interestingly, as I alluded to, dominoes are being used today to develop strategies for cities to mitigate effects of global warming. Chains of interlinked effects can be made vivid and provide insight into situations where friction, especially of buildings next to the earth, become important, as they do in climate change. And in the group of extensive drawings I had done, I used a variety of material surfaces to get that across. Scientists, going on to the next. Well, scientist Kei-Shin Liu of Peking University pointed out that domino-like behavior is ubiquitous and seen in phenomena ranging from nanofriction and molecular collisions to earthquakes and economic activity. In short, models of dominoes can represent climate change risks to interconnected systems, and his quote is, characterizing the relationship between macroscopic motion and microscopic mechanisms of such systems has been one of the fundamental scientific issues. Up to the next. This is the work that uses a different model, a model called Cellular Automata, which many or even all of you might be familiar with. And it applies cellular automata to images that are scanned of bacteria. In this work, it models the proliferation of bacterial organisms during Superstorm Sandy in 2012. Today, urban CA cellular automata models are used to predict how urban growth is affected by sea level rise in different contexts. The models that are done today can incorporate urban planning policies and have been used to study patterns in biological systems, traffic systems, economic systems, environmental systems, and social systems. The basic idea, and you can see a little representation in the lower right is that the complex patterns result from simple rules. And I'll have more to say about that in a little while. Another model for my work, especially thinking of Superstorm Sandy, was the slime mold. In the slime mold, organization of parts becomes a new whole with divergent behavioral patterns. When food is available, the slime mold organizes into a single multicellular blobby organism and becomes carnivorous. When food is scarce, it breaks down into a swarm of single-celled organisms and begins to photosynthesize. So in similar works on paper, I was considering the way urban routes were destroyed and rerouted during the storm. I took a cue from another scientific experiment in which scientists used the slime molds to determine ways to rebuild their and reroute transportation routes. In other words, the cellular automata modeled the behavior of slime molds that refine their networks to optimize for the transport of nutrients. Note the Brooklyn Bridge in the background, and it's a kind of Lego-like depiction that I used. I long expected that my generation of architects would be building Lego-like structures given the prevalence of these toy models in their childhood. So this is a depiction which is really dedicated to the Challenger tragedy, which was personal for me because I'd received permission from NASA in 1985, and I actually was to have been there at the time of the Challenger disaster, but it got rescheduled 2 months earlier. Soon after 9/11, it occurred to me that technology and innovation were in several respects really quite similar to biological evolution, and I made works that incorporated redraftings of US Patent Office drawings. They, for me, were epitomized images at the crossroads of technology, economics, and politics. Now, they were static, but I nevertheless tried to capture the dynamic feedback mechanisms of learning that propel innovation. The references that you see that are listed from one invention to the next reflect ongoing adjustments inherent in patented inventions over more than a 200-year span since the Patent Office was founded at the time of the Constitution. My work assumed an evolutionary cast due to such commonalities between the way organisms evolve and the way artifacts generate spin-offs that are related. I'll do these quickly. These are works that were inspired by the Whole Earth catalog, which Stuart Brand edited. And it introduced my generation to Fuller's geodesic domes. The journal and this work explored tensions between the distrust of technology and faith in reform, progress versus preservation of nature. Lucy Laporte selected these for a show, which she saw as a kind of portrait of capitalism, along with a critique, and the show took place at Boulder. I continue in this to use the USTPO as a source of data to generate these images. And here I'm asking what habitats in space might look at, whether you would have the same problems such as equitable access to mineral resources and water, and questioning how viable space is as a habitable resource. About 6 years ago, I added to this augmented reality, usually triggered by one of the patent images. It was a way to critique some of the ideas of progress being necessarily good and to show overlooked values. The animations I made ask such questions as who cleans space, questioning feminism and women astronauts. The other question is what happened to the wildlife at Cape Canaveral during space shuttle launches? In fact, the animation I did shows how Cape Canaveral led to the extinction of the dusky seaside sparrow. And as a last image, I constructed space habitats springing from patented inventions, asking what it might be like to actually be living in our inventions. From here, you see a view of Earth. The rectangular white geometric structures represent an aerial view of patterns formed by migrant tents. Now, I will go now to the second part of my talk. Here are 2 pages from Darcy Wentworth Thompson's On Growth Informed, which was published in 1917 and continue to hold untapped potential for architecture as well as art. On the left is a medusoid, and on the right are water droplets forming a corona. Art historian Martin Kemp has stated that Thompson's work holds the possibility of explaining remarkable patterns of shared morphology, not only between different organisms and on different scales, but also, importantly, between living things and inanimate things. Now, my choice of background becomes clear here. This is the cover of an anthology that I co-edited with art historian Carissa Terranova about Thompson's generative influences on art, architecture, and design. The anthology, in turn, led to my receiving a commission to curate a related exhibition. And in this respect, I followed the footsteps of pop artist Richard Hamilton. In 1951, Hamilton curated a show about Thompson's On Growth and Form at the ICA in London. The cover, which is spectacular, is by Janet Eckelman. And note the deformed net. It can suggest phases of evolutionary development, such as cell and organ differentiation, which a number of both artists and architects have followed up on. On to the next image. Now, of course, in architecture, Thompson's ideas were formative in the structural engineering of the space frame, influencing the design of Louis Kahn and Ting, Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller and later Ken Snelson became known for foldable tensegrity structures, skeleton-like assemblages of wires in tension and struts in compression that date from the 1960s. One of our anthology's contributors was Stephen Wolfram, the mathematician. He developed computation in simple programs that could simulate forms in nature. He used the cellular automata on the left to simulate a random walk, and on the right to mimic some of these forms that are found in nature through producing computational rules. Here is a little bit more specificity that you can see on the right in particular that each of these shells, he has found a way to use cellular automata to duplicate nature's patterns. Cells are, the way it works is seen on the left. Cells are typically blackened according to whether the surrounding local cells are black or white. Emergent features can result and the outcome relies on many factors interacting at different phases over time. These are works involved with these principles by Haresh Lalvani, which I included in the exhibition I curated at the Pratt Manhattan Gallery in conjunction with the anthology on Darcy Thompson's influence, to create these stainless steel sculptures. Each one of five starts out the same and generates this variety of forms. He uses algorithms to define forces, which he then applies to flat planes, coaxing them to grow into myriad variations on a work. His algorithm morphs the pattern, but the actual differences that you see here from one to the other result from forces applied to the developing matter. So he really bridges the gap between fluid architectural geometry and the limitations of sheet metal. On the next image you see is an image of embryos packed together, looking like soap bubbles. Darcy Thompson pursued this kind of circumstance, comparing the cells in a frog's egg with soap films. According to architect and theorist Sarah Bonmaison, bubbles are excellent models for architects to explore. In the anthology, she explores conceptions of the organic via August Schlegel, Peter Sloterdijk, and Buckminster Fuller. She reports that roughly from the 1960s to the 80s, architecture schools exploited nature via Thompson's principles in On Growth and Form, and that was required reading. And she goes on to go into work by Ann Ting. Louis Kahn talks about how Penn students were exposed to work by engineer Robert Riccolet, who had a laboratory focused on lightweight structures for bridges and towers. She discusses how Fry Otto's modeling techniques were a way of working through aesthetic and technical issues. All of these people have declared allegiance, basically, and indebtedness to Darcy Thompson's Growth and Form. She concludes, quote, ephemeral lightweight structures from inflatables to tensile structures offered a building technology and materials that allowed great freedom to experiment. Now, I'll look at some other insights that were gleaned from On Growth and Form. This is a book by mathematician Alan Gurielli, a page in which Thompson's work has been updated, and it concerns the importance of measurements and allometry. Basically, Thompson explained the biological equivalent of what engineers call a size effect during growth. In addition to geometry, the strength of the material is taken into account. And here, another page by Gurielli. He considers paleontologist David Raupp's work on logarithmically coiled organisms, which also relied on Thompson in a totally different field. He was concerned with the dynamic architecture of organisms that would challenge neo-Darwinian frameworks of evolutionary theory by examining morphogenic principles derived from Thompson. He looked at form through its material and functional morphology as apart from adaptation in the Darwinian sense. And in this particular example, in these pages, he uses 3 different coiling parameters to show the range of morphologic possibilities. And one of the things that this model did is allow him to examine morphologies that don't yet exist, which I think is something that a lot of people, including some of you, would be interested in. We go to the next. But this this goes back to the idea of the deformed net and the cover that you saw on our book by Janet Eckelman. His theory of transformations became renowned because they suggested at the time, remember it was written in 1917, at that time it seemed a way to, in a way, ignore Darwin and yet be able to morph one species into another. According to Carolyn O'Donnell, the architect, these diagrams famously superimpose a Cartesian grid on a series of organisms and generate through a series of stretching, compressing, skewing, shearing, and radial operations, a range of possible variations within a type. Now, I included the next slide because it may be familiar to some of you. This space and show is in fact Teeth Space and the exhibition that Stephen Hall had of Ricky Albenda's work in 2018 before the COVID affliction. After I saw this work, I invited Ricky Albenda to participate in the Pratt Manhattan show called Forces to Forms, as his construction of bulging and distorted segments suggest topological investigations that then materialize optical and perspectival phenomena, which have implications for architecture and for city planning. Back to architect Carolyn O'Donnell, she looks at Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand and the kind of typological thinking he was involved with in 1800 and the way he classified building types. The aim then was to compose, collage, or combine elements according to simple rules. And this was very much, according to O'Donnell, tied to the thinking about species. The subject of evolution keeps getting introduced, and it's so important both to architecture and art. So here is an example where you can see the thinking at that time in the early 19th century, just before revolutionary theories of Lamarck, Darwin, and Wallace transformed the discipline of biology. O'Donnell humorously points out that a giraffe in Durand's system, for example, was a camel leopardus, which is a portmanteau or a combination of the words camel and leopard. So that the idea was that a species at that time, a new species, was a combination of two established species. And here, O'Donnell looks to the architecture of Greg Lynn, and who argues for a dynamic formalism. He wants to go beyond the static model and states that a more dynamic method of diagramming is necessary. In this, everything should be a gradient of an ever-changing form. Computational rules, like we've seen with Wolfram, allow for a more fluid transformation and a system that allows including external forces. As computer scripts are capable now of generating varied options, evolutionary terminology has pervaded the world of architecture, and you see concerns that are shared with biology, such as species, iteration, generation, variation, mutation in art as well as architecture. And in the next work, here she invokes Thomson's famous transformation diagrams, organisms generated through topologically stretching and compressing the coordinates. Her main point is to ask, what are the invisible forces that are active but unseen in these transformations? She proposes that architects should draw in those elements that motivate the forces acting on the organisms in order to address issues of context. So she wants architects to look to the world beyond the grid and to find ways to include this information graphically in order to create new forms of architecture. Another architect has been grappling with the example of Darcy Thompson and has an altogether different approach. He explores, this is Philip Beasley's work, he explores interactive quasi-living architecture with a living architecture systems group. And here they create a model of an astrocyte referring to the form of a nerve cell containing radiating connections to a myriad of surrounding cells. So that is his model. And we'll see more in the next image where he basically is guided by concepts stemming from Ilya Prigoghine's dissipative forms, Gavin Crook's renewed definition of dissipative adaptation, and Jeremy England's writing on evolutionary dynamics. The aim is that understanding what goes into architecture will contribute to a new architecture. These thinkers have contributed to a reform substantially of the meaning of entropy. Dissipative forms might seem ephemeral, but Beasley maintains they are in fact tenacious and durable. Interestingly, of course, artist Robert Smithson also relied on entropy as a model for his work. And this is yet another of his works. The noosphere refers to life on Earth as a vast organism. And here you can see his concern really is with the cosmos, the subject of the talk today. And it has a thinking skin due to some of the incorporation of artificial intelligence elements. In these assembled scaffolds that his group uses result from a kind of design that resembles natural tensegrity-based systems. And he says, quote, a new city designed to easily handle unstable conditions of cooling and heating and rapid cycles of shading heat and warming and collecting heat again might well look like a hybrid forest where each building is made from dense layers of ivy-like filters and porous openings. So that is his takeaway from this. So what does it mean to use evolution as a model today? Basically, we've undergone a major shift from Darwin's conception of a tree-like nature to a rhizome. And again, I would say for those who are interested, you might want to read the works of microbiologists Lynn Margulis and Carl Wuss, who expanded the field of evolutionary biology as they uncovered a huge extent among early organisms of lateral gene transfer of basically inheritable material across organisms. So instead of going the road of descent, you have evolution now occurring, which we know is true through horizontal gene transfer. And that's given rise to a lot of new scientific information. So what is this? In many ways, we're talking about a new kind of organicism, I would argue, one increasingly informed by science and technology, coming about because architects are seeking a new scientific legitimacy for forms that can combine functionalism with the natural mechanical efficiencies that you see in leaves, tusks, horns, etc., and renewed interest in the complexity of living organisms. And so some of my conclusions: one, forms have assumed new actualities in the current landscape of complex systems, generative art, bioart, and bioarchitecture. These are developments that have been propelled in part by Thompson. Elements collectively modify their surroundings and can influence back the original interactions, which may in turn change the collective behavior. So we're talking here about feedback. And finally, the insights gained, which your generation is presented in, must now be used toward warding off environmental disaster and species extinction. The city's complexity lies largely in the intertwined network of feedback relations among its elements, be they physical, political, economic, or environmental. So this is my last image, and it's really a provocation for you as architects with new developing ideas. What if you take the narwhal and his tusk, which is in reality a tooth, as a model? What does this say about architecture you might construct? Now, I will end this by telling you what Darcy Thompson made of the narwhal. He argued that the thrust of the narwhal's tail applied a very slight torque to the body. The tusk resisted this force with some success. And basically, the narwhal revolves slowly around its own tusk. And over the years, irregularities of the socket resulted in the characteristic striations of the surface of a, quote, tooth. The tooth itself is not twisted. Now, I think the key things in thinking about what kind of architectural form it might result in, remember, it can break turbulent water. That has a lot to do with resisting the force of water and erosion, and it breaks symmetry. The tooth operates like a rudder. So I will end giving D.W. Thompson the last word. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was a deep dive into a very complex set of questions and history that supports all these explorations. We'd like to ask, is Jingwen leading the conversation, or any of our residents we would like to open up the conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen, for giving us such an amazing lecture. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or chat yet, so I guess I can ask a question first. So I really liked like all your collages, like when talking about the model part. So I was wondering if you could give us some more elaboration and details of how you created those amazing collages and how you expect them to really impact this kind of discourse in using art inspired by biology and geology and all those kind of other interdisciplinary matters into like forming a new model for architecture that can change the society. Yeah, thank you.
You know, part of this really comes back to my own exposure to Darcy Thompson. I had seen the book published in 1917 when I was in high school. And over a course of decades, I came to understand more fully what it meant. Now, the original book had something like 500 images in it, and many of them were juxtapositions of animate and inanimate forms, which intrigued me right away as an artist because they seemed like opposites, which they are in certain ways. And so I was very compelled to pursue this. I also found incredibly important to me and my development as an artist to be working collaboratively when I've curated or when I've written, because it's not just me. It's like there was a force of complex systems that I recognized and found ways to try to apply in my art and try to get a sense of the whole. I was also lucky enough to work for a time with Stephen Jay Gould on basically on an art journal issue devoted to contemporary art and the genetic code. And I hadn't realized fully until speaking with him numerous times how important Darcy Thompson was to his thinking. But again, when you're making art, the actual specifics of, in the case of visual art, texture, weight of paper, materials, I found paper really most attuned to what I was doing and continue to, although I've also done this in paintings. But there were a number of variables I could play with. And so that's some of the history of my doing this. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'd be interested to know, and I'll ask whether some of you as young architects would find these older models or recurrent ones of interest. I assume that most of you at this point in time use complex systems in your work.
Yeah, they're definitely very interesting. And like also you talk about all those like mathematical models like cellular automata. And it's just very, I think it's very encouraging that we're kind of like merging science and math and biology with art and architecture. It feels very nice to have like a quantitative background and to really back our research and back our creation. And so I feel like your talk is very optimistic.
I have a question. Thank you for this great talk. You spoke about some of the cellular growth patterns, which I guess this was from the studies from Greg Lynn and the emergence from a single organism to a gradient variable kind of system. I wonder, in trying to stay true to the sentiment of this connection to ecology and the kind of the various spheres, like the noosphere that you mentioned and biosphere and these things, when it takes shape in architectural form, I find that the highly computational generative models, they tend to work against the original sentiment of being this connection between human and the natural world, let's say. So, I mean, what advice, or can you talk a little bit about how we can make that that connection a bit more humane and perhaps truer to the original thesis of trying to connect back to the ecology, because I find that a lot of these forms, like just strictly on architectural form, they end up being kind of governed by the computer, let's say, and the kind of parameters that the computer operates based on. So just it seems to be a bit counter to the original kind of the beauty of the original sentiment.
No, that's an interesting observation. And it's something, again, I think that fine artists grapple with too. I personally like a combination of analog and digital form and would never think of relying only on digital form. I like the feel, I like the actual physicality of something. And I know, for example, the Mac Architecture Center had a whole issue devoted to forms of Greg Lynn and others using genetic algorithms, and they sort of played on it, calling it genomes. And I think that we've arrived at a place where we're looking at something that can take advantage of the, in a way, simplicity with which Darcy Thompson himself used these forms. And again, I would probably say that a lot of it depends on the choice of a model. Greg Lynn, or rather Philip Beasley, are using models from neuroscience, cellular models, and this has legitimacy if you think of the slime mold, for example, with its nodes and networks. But there are other kinds of models, which is why I brought in the narwhal. That spiraling tower is a feature of architecture which is actually classical. You see it in many buildings. So I would say that in your own searches for models that will help enable the kind of vision you have, or one has as an architect or as an artist, look for an aesthetic, something that aesthetically appeals. I think the aesthetics is incredibly important.
Thank you. That's a beautiful elaboration. Thank you.
Ellen, I'd like to ask a question. First of all, thank you. As an artist, I was really deeply affected by those first images you showed of your own work, especially with the dominoes. And so I really thank you for sharing that with us. And it's such a treasure for you to be present and to talk about that imagery. So thank you. Later on, you spoke a little bit about this notion of progress. So you touched upon that within your work, especially with the Coca-Cola imagery and all of that. And I'm wondering, what do you have to say about this idea of progress in our current moment? Technologically, scientifically, it seems we're making all these advances. At the same time, a lot of those advances, of course, are having incredible ecological impact as a detriment. And then, politically, it feels like in many areas we are backsliding. And so I'm wondering what you might have to say about some of those ideas and concepts and frameworks that you showed in your work applied to this current moment.
Well, that's great. One of the things I've read almost all the works at this point in time by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a favorite. He's a science fiction writer who is obviously totally immersed in ecology, ecological problems, and solutions for the future. The most recent book, I believe, or one of them, is Ministry for the Future. And he offers several possibilities, for example, of keeping the feedback mechanism that would cause glaciers to continue to erode and produce more water by pumping up the water from the surface. I mean, and I know that engineers are actually seriously considering these solutions, but he goes further than that, because he also I noticed his book started out far along in time, in either the future or the past, and they're creeping, it seems to me, closer and closer to our own age. And therefore, I see that solutions he's coming up with are not only within sight, but he also goes the extra step of linking them to behavioral problems, social behavioral problems, to our conceptions of the universe, of the cosmos. That's one of the reasons I was so thrilled that this particular group of talks is dealing with the cosmos, because he doesn't, we're working at a time, all of us, we're working at a time where group thinking is important, and that no one person will have any answers, and the answers have to come from a lot of different fields. And we better get used to it.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you so much. And yeah, Ministry for the Future is absolutely on my list. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I had kind of a related question to what Stephen originally brought up with the imagery that you showed of the dominoes. I was so captivated with that because early on in kind of my architecture education, I became so interested in the idea of semiotics and how can things be communicative tools, and just kind of, you know, from a different way to enter the question of a model, how do you view the importance of semiotics, or the importance of communicating these ideas more so than just using them? I think you mentioned models kind of as a scientific proof as one way to be viewed, but how do you also view them in this kind of more language sense? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, that's a great question. And I think you can see, as one example, I've noticed as somebody who's read a lot of both Darwin and also the work of Darcy Thompson, you have a very different approach, and you can see the differences in the language each uses. With Thompson about transitions, the word portmanteau that was pointed out by Carolyn O'Donnell is a perfect example that if you think of the species as a combination of two different animals, this really neglects the kinds of transitions that lie between them. So I think that the language is really essential. It's built into it. That's another reason, by the way, to read Darcy Thompson. He had a classical education, and many people consider it the most beautifully written treatise ever came out. But in some of my research on this book, talk about language and classification systems, I ended up going to what is now called the Ernst Mayr Library, which is their biology library at Harvard University, because an old friend told me that when he was there in the 50s, that the books had been arranged as if the topics were species. And I mentioned this to the young librarian, and she said, yes, absolutely. And she showed me a whole group of books that still had not been reclassified according to the Dewey system or the prevalence system. And then, of course, I thought, sure, Ernst Mayr was at the heart of these classification debates that were going on. And it had its essence. You could see this in language and the way classification systems existed. They're definitely present in the language. And in fact, I'll give you one more way it's being used that somebody here might take up, which is interesting. CRISPR-Cas9 is a recent technology, right? You're all familiar with it. Artists are now using this. One artist, Portuguese artist Marcia de Menezes, is using it to find corn. In other words, she's looking at the genome that exists now and sort of back engineering it to try to get at which is a language problem, by the way, deleting parts of a genome. It's very much like taking out adjectives and verbs and so forth. So basically, she's trying to reverse engineer what the original species of corn, wild corn, might have been. it's interesting. People are doing this now or thinking of doing this with animals that are nearly extinct. Language is definitely at the root of this.
Thank you so much. That's such a, it's tough in what I kind of think of is it's so easy to segregate these fields, but when you take a step back, it's all, connected and it's all part of the same problem. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, everyone.
Jingwen, there is a question in the chat. You may want to take that on.
So I think Beza asked, great talk, Ellen. In the image of the black and white shells and a selection of color based on the adjacent space, it reminded me of the strategies used in the game of Go, comment, and also how it might relate to cartography and a grid laid over an irregular or 3D shape, good homologous projection of the globe, and a stretched grid. Any connections and Mahalo?
Oh, that's a really provocative question. How wonderful. Yes, I mean, we know that the game of Go is played in several different dimensions. And actually, again, I know an artist, Lillian Ball, who has based her work as an ecological artist on the game of Go. But the aim is, before going into your specific question, the aim of her game is to have no one winner. Her point is that we have to have cooperation to behaviorally in order to try to solve some of these environmental problems. So in the game of Go she devised, two people have to reach a compromise. I cannot, it would be complicated to try to explain the modeling of that game. But again, I know it's done with computers, but it also is done without computers. And for anyone interested in this subject, for architects, I would really recommend Linda Henderson's book on the fourth dimension in art, which must have come out like 30 years ago, to see very fascinating examples of how artists have used geometry and hypergeometries, which are only, again, magnifying right now. But I would think, again, don't forget the point that Carolyn O'Donnell makes, which is that the deformed grid is really important in terms of the context. Janet Eckelman's work, she is a sculptor, but actually it's very much like architecture, because the scale of her work is of several city blocks that span these large areas. So I think that the way her works deform the grid actually touch on the answer to your question. But the question's too complex to give a simple answer to. If anybody is interested, you've noted my email, levy@nysc.rr.com, and I'd be happy to point you to references of interest for you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That means so much. And it was an amazing lecture and conversation, very inspiring. Very happy to go through your work and your presence and see your experience and your process. It was truly meaningful. Thank you so much, Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us today, and our panelists for asking the questions. And for your information, our next lecture, titled as The Influences of Books by William Stout, architect, architectural book publisher and collector, will be tomorrow on Wednesday, July 13th at 1 p.m. New York time. Please see the link in the chat if you would like to register, and do not forget to stay connected to T-Space and come for a visit. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great day. Thank you, Ellen.
Bye-bye.